members, the one with the unbreakables at the back, will be asking our panelists questions. During this time, what we ask you to do is to please put your insights in the chat, put your questions in the chat. This is very much an interactive session, so we are not speaking to you. We want you to be involved. We want your thoughts. We want your questions as well. So she will then put in the formal questions to the panelists. We will interject once in a while to address certain questions that you may have. But at the end, we will have a formal Q&A. Thereafter, we will close off summarizing today's discussion. But I think what we need to do right now is introduce you to our esteemed panelists. What we have is the cream de la cream of Africa's policymakers. These are the people that create the Africa that we want. They are involved in that creation. So first and foremost, let me see if I can spot him here. But I did see him a while ago. I'm going to ask him to put on his camera. We have Amine, Idriss, Adoum. I'm going to apologize in advance. I did not want to speak as I am terrible with pronouncing names. So if I pronounce your name incorrectly, I apologize well in advance. When you come to South Africa, I will take you out for dinner. Not a problem. Okay. So he is the Senior Director of Economic Integration, Industrialization, and Infrastructure at the African Union Development Agency. With over 20 years of experience, he spearheads major initiatives driving Africa's economic growth, including the Program for Infrastructure Development in Africa and the AfCFTA. His work is pivotal in transforming Africa into a prosperous and integrated continent. So we are so honored to have you with us in terms of the work that you've done and your organization has done, so relevant with trade, or rather in pushing trade in Africa. Next, we have, I'm not sure if she's on the call. Let's have a look. Our next panelist is Zodwa. Zodwa, are you with us today? Zodwa? Okay. Okay, and then next up, we've got Dr. Ifeoga. If you can kindly switch on your camera for us. I did spot you. If you don't mind, would you kindly switch on your camera for us, just so that our attendees can see you? Okay, I can assure you guys she is on the call. Let me just give you a brief summary of her title. She's a regional coordination specialist for the AfCFTA project at the UNDP Regional Bureau of Africa. Zodwa Mabuza is also on the line. She's a seasoned economist and the chief of sub-regional. Oh, there you are, Zodwa. Thank you so much. If you can kindly switch on your camera for us, let's have a look. There you go. Are you able to switch it on? Okay, Zodwa, we'll sort that out later on. Thank you so much for joining us. And then we've got Michael Sudarkasa. I thought I saw you. If you can kindly switch on your camera if you are able. Oh, Zodwa, there you are. Lovely to meet you. Lovely to meet you.
Lovely to meet
Michael
you all.
is the chairman of the Africa Business Group, a firm dedicated to fostering economic and business development across the continent. He specializes in strengthening private sector development, promoting investment, and facilitating trade within Africa and between Africa and its and the world. And then lastly, we've got Rutendo. Dr. Rutendo, I thought I saw you on the line. If you can kindly switch on your camera. Let's have a look.
I'm here. I'm on one of the many pages. But I'm here.
You're on one of the many pages. Lovely to see a familiar face. Dr. Rutendo is a founder and CEO of the Tribe Africa Advisory with over 30 years of leadership experience spanning over 20 African countries. He is a trusted advisor to public and private organizations, guiding them in building leadership capacity and developing successful business growth strategies for the African continent. So I know that I did not do everyone's bio justice. For that, I apologize. But with that said, let's first of all introduce my team. These are the individuals with the unbreakables at the back. So this is the research team that made this discussion possible. The research team that shares the passion, our passion rather, for trade in Africa, that truly believes that the AfCFTA is transformative, and it's one of the tools that we believe will make Africa self-sufficient. So the unbreakables, round of applause to you guys for making this possible. Alrighty, so let's get the show on the road. I'm going to finally introduce you to our moderator, my colleague, also part of the Unbreakables, Judith. Judith is an accomplished facilitator and digital marketing specialist, renowned for her ability to guide focused and impactful discussions. And that's exactly what she will do today. Guide us in this focused and impactful discussion around the AfCFTA. Guys, once again, thank you so much for joining, but we've only just begun. Please engage and enjoy this discussion.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Lucinda. And again, once again, welcome to everybody on the call, to the highly esteemed panelists that we have. I cannot wait to hear all the expert advice and expert insights that you guys have to share with us today, as well as everybody else in the chat, you know, just willing to take the time out of their day. I know that is not easy, and just to hear the impact of our research and just to gain more insights from that. So without any further ado, I want to just open this panel with just a starter question, just to get the mood around the room, to understand from each of our experts what it is that we are willing to get out of this conversation. Right? Just understand where you guys stand in terms of what the AfCFTA is. And for those that are on the call not sure what the AfCFTA is, it is the African Continental Free Trade Area. So we will be referring to that quite a lot. So let me start with the question, and then we'll just go around the room with our expert panel, just to get where you guys stand with this. So, with the rising global trade barriers and economic uncertainties, why is the African Continental Free Trade Area especially important right now? And what makes Africa's economic integration particularly relevant on today's world stage? I'm going to start with Mr. Amine Adoum.
Thank you very much, Judith, and good evening to everyone. Actually, thank you for inviting me for this event. I am actually in Johannesburg. I'm happy to connect and to share with you. Now, just going straight to the question, why AfCFTA matters. Maybe let me explain what is it in the AfCFTA first, basically, because we hear a lot about that. But basically, AfCFTA, we consider it as the engine of the Africa economic integration. That's actually the purpose of the AfCFTA. And there are several, I think, very important features that we have in the AfCFTA. The AfCFTA aims to eliminate all the tariff and non-tariff barriers to stimulate our intra-African trade. As you know, intra-African trade is quite low or even weak. If you take some regions, let's take the Central Africa region and the Western Africa region, they are neighbors. But can you imagine that the trade exchange between the two actually is, I think, lower than 5% of, it totalizes less than 5% of their total trade. This is actually crazy, you know. It's unbelievable, but this is the fact today. AfCFTA as well aims to strengthen member states' capacity in trade regulation and implementation of trade protocols. This is extremely important because our countries don't necessarily, at least not all of them, have the same level of capacity in terms of regulating trade and implementing as well trade protocol, including the one of AfCFTA itself. Then as well, we want to harmonize custom procedures and logistics as well. That with the objective to streamline trade operations between our countries, but also within our countries, because believe it or not, in some places in Africa, what you see in one city, even within the countries, trade is difficult, and that mostly because of logistics issues, logistics challenge within the same country. We also want through AfCFTA to deepen our integration, and mostly, and this is extremely important, between North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa, because we are all in the same continent. But when we speak about Africa, many people forget that Africa is actually from Tunis to Cape Town, right? We forget that it's not. There are two capes in Africa. There is the what we call in French Cap Bon, which is the Tunis, and Cap de Bonne-Espérance, which is actually Cape Town. The Cape of Good Hope is Cape Town, and the Cape of Good is actually in Tunis. This is all Africa. Yeah, it's Cape of Good Hope and Cape of Good. Actually, this is how we put it like that. And not many people actually understand that we need really to integrate. So this is globally, if you want the AfCFTA, but then with the AfCFTA, and I hope I'll come back to that later, we have as well several other elements. One of the main, I would say, goal that we are pursuing is to establish what we call, at least for us in AUDA-NEPAD, what we call a unified Africa electricity market. This is extremely important. So can you imagine if we can achieve to have one single electricity market across the continent, knowing that energy is one of our biggest challenges in the continent, and there are regions that are quite good in producing, they have good capacity, and there are regions and countries that are actually completely lagging, capacity for production. So we want as well to use the AfCFTA to do that. We want as well through the AfCFTA establish a single African air transport market, because today, believe it or not, flying from Johannesburg to Dakar is just a few years ago, there was SAA was going to Dakar. SAA doesn't go to Dakar anymore. Or try to go from Dakar to Bissau. You can't. It will take you 2 days. Just from Johannesburg to Bissau. It will take easily 2-3 days. And sometimes you have to go through Europe or Asia before you go there. And that is one of the problems we want to fix as well through the AfCFTA with the establishment of the single African air transport market. But we want as well, this is extremely important, strengthen as well our intra-African payment systems. Because if you buy good today in Senegal and you are in South Africa, you have to use SWIFT, you have to use some cash transfer, extremely difficult. So with AfCFTA, we have created what we call the PAPS, which is the Pan-African payment and settlement systems. So, and that's actually one of the main results of the AfCFTA. It's already functioning, but it must be generalized. Then, of course, we want as well to strengthen our member states, their institutional capacity, making them capable of negotiating. And finally, and this is important, 2 more features, I will come back to that, industrialization and digitalization. Actually, they are key to our Africa economic autonomy, and as well the tourism and the creative industries, because this is a sector which is usually neglected. So those are the things I would say the features of the ACFTA, and we are hoping that through that, that will help us to position ourselves as a big and good and solid partner on the international arena. So imagine if you have a CFTA, all the problems that we are having today, the questions that we are asking ourselves with Donald Trump tariff war, I don't think that we will be scared. As of now, many people are scared, right? Because we don't really have this instrument. So this is actually what I can say to start with, to begin with. Thank you.
I appreciate that so much. I think it is very critical that we understand exactly these elements that make up what the AfCFTA is. Like I said, this is what we're going to be touching a lot on. And Mr. Adoum, I love that you've touched on a lot of the points that we're still going to expand on, right? We're going to talk about the current global external environment and how that is impacting trade right now in Africa. You know, what should Africa's response be? I don't want us to get ahead of ourselves now. I'll move to the next speaker. Ms. Zodwa Mabuza, if you can just give us an overview of just what you think. Why is the African continental free trade especially important right now? What are your thoughts around that? And what makes it relevant in today's world stage?
Thank you very much, Judith. I'll start off from where Idriss ended. Currently, intra-African trade is estimated around 15 to 17%, which is much lower than in other regions. This basically means we are not trading among ourselves as African member states. And one of the reasons is that we largely trade in commodities, in raw materials. But then there is hope, which is why there is so much excitement about the African Continental Free Trade Area. When you analyze intra-Africa trade, the bulk of it is in manufactures, which again emphasizes the point made by Idriss that we really need to industrialize to be able to trade. Otherwise, if we do not invest in industrialization, there is nothing to trade with because we are all currently trading in raw materials and commodities, which is why most regions, for instance, if you look at SADC, they're putting a lot of emphasis on industrialization. And my agency, the UN agency that I work for in Southern Africa, we are focusing mainly on industrial development. We're helping our members to basically industrialize. We have the agro processing zone between Zambia, Zimbabwe. We're looking at battery manufacturing between DR Congo, Zambia, and then Zimbabwe wants to join. So we have to first industrialize before we can actually take advantage of the African continental free trade area. It is very relevant. But obviously, there are challenges of connectivity because when you consider that 16 African member states are landlocked, we do need to invest in transport, in energy infrastructure. Again, without energy, we cannot industrialize. And a number of countries in the region, in Africa, have energy crisis. I'm based in Zambia. We are in constant load shedding, and I'm sure it's the same issue with South Africa. So the African continental free trade area is relevant in that it will attract investment, because if we are focusing on boosting our industrial development, then we'll be attracting investment, we'll be creating jobs for the young people. Again, you will sort of like stop young people from leaving the continent. If there are job opportunities within the continent, then they will stay within the continent. We will also be able to avoid being affected by external shocks. The talk these days is President Trump's tariffs. But if we've grown our own market, which is a market of 1.4 billion people with a GDP of about, okay, it's gone down 2.82 trillion as of 2024. It's a huge market that we can capitalize on, but there are things that we need to do to make it work. I'll end there for now.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that, Zodwa. I think just a follow-up question from me, in terms of what you said, 100% agreed that industrialization is the key to Africa's trade endeavors. But do you have a sense of how far we are within that space, that industrialization space? How much more work needs to be done?
Well, there's a lot of work that needs to be done. But if you look at the instruments of the African Continental Free Trade Area, like rules of origin, they are very supportive of industrialization in the continent. If you consider the local content requirements, and the, you know, what you can import outside to make a good qualify for originating in Africa, it is supportive. So we need to start implementing what we've agreed on, but certainly, because if you look at the contribution of manufacturing to GDP in most countries, it's really low. It's quite low. So there's quite a lot of work that we need to do, which is why the CFTA is an opportunity, because then it provides a much larger market to enable countries to benefit from economies of scale. And if we remove we've agreed to remove tariffs, but we also need to address the issue of non-tariff barriers.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. All right, moving over to Dr. Ifeogo. Let's just give you the floor as well, just to unpack for us why the AfCFTA is especially important right now, building off our previous two speakers. Happy to do that.
No, thank you very much, and thanks to those who have spoken so far. So I think there's a few things we can highlight. One is that the AfCFTA is not necessarily a new concept. It builds upon the recs. We have ECOWAS, which was sort of the first formally constituted rec that is celebrating 50 years in 2025. And from that, we then saw the PTU, that is now COMESA, we saw ECAS, SADC, and there's a few more. What's interesting to note is that many of the recs, as we call them, the blocks in Africa, are premised on free trade area agreements. And so what one can say is that it was always the plan for Africa to have an African continental free trade agreement. If you look at a lot of the older instruments, it was always in the plan. It's just that it's happening now. And what is good about that is that there's the opportunity to learn from the existing recs. So, for example, you'll find that the non-tariff barriers, the reporting mechanism that exists in the AfCFTA, actually started in East Africa and has now been scaled up across the continent, right? So it's an opportunity, the AfCFTA is an opportunity to reflect on what the continent has, what has worked, what has not worked, and then how to integrate. So that's one of the good things that one can say about the AfCFTA. The second thing to highlight is that the AfCFTA is expansive. If you look through the protocols, there's a protocol on trading goods, protocol on trading services, there's a protocol on investments, there's a protocol on e-trade, right? And this accounts for the reality of the economies we're in that trading goods is important, right? But can you make your goods without services? Can you make your goods if you don't have power, right? Can you make your goods if you don't have skills? So you can't have trading goods if you don't have trading services, essentially, more or less. It's an argument that one can make. Even for your services, if you open a hotel or a spa, you need goods. You'll have to get some sort of goods or furniture in. So it really reflects the interconnectedness of economies. And it also highlights the continent's ambition in that even when you think about investment, the idea is that we'll all eventually move to the same sort of rules around that, right? And while we talk a lot about trading goods, if we look over the last 20 to 30 years and you take a look at those economies that have diversified and have grown, a lot of the time they have large services sectors. And some actually went the services route before they went the trading goods route. fruit, right? We have economies that are premised also on technology. The point of that is to say that there's not one route to grow. There's not one route to industrialize. And it's good that the AfCFTA, through its protocols and the rules it tries to create for the continent, accounts for that so that, whatever works for what country can be applied. And then thirdly, in just thinking through the geopolitical issues, if we even take a look back at COVID, you'll find that one of the first things to happen was that supply chains took a hit. People immediately said, we're not exporting this, we're not exporting that, right? And, one might say, oh, where was the spirit of, we're all in this together? But it was a crisis. And people will take care of their interests first, as we saw. And at that time, I think it really came to the fore, the need for Africa to sort itself out, if we want to be, a bit simplistic about it. And again, a few years after, we're seeing what's going on in the world, right? Now, the thing is, people trade with their neighbors anywhere in the world. There is trade in Africa. A lot of it is unaccounted for. A lot of it is what we call informal. A lot of it is what we call small scale. I would even go further to argue that some of the seemingly informal trade has actually been enabled by the recs and by the rules that allow people to take their trading goods across board without having to document. So in one way, you can argue that facilitating trade has sort of made it a little less seen in the books, because if you ask the customs person to allow the goods go, he's probably not going to write it down. Right. But if you then went to look, and I've worked on a few of these kinds of initiatives, and you go and stand at a border or at a market, you see that goods come from everywhere. If you went to the market anywhere in Africa and said, where does this food come from? A lot of the time it came from somewhere else. So these flows exist. And the AfCFTA, I think, presents us with an opportunity to better capture our value chains, better capture our flows, better document how we trade, because there is trade. We just have not particularly well presented how that works, and then think through how can we trade better with ourselves. Because if the AfCFTA doesn't start intra-African trade, what it does is it improves the terms of that trade, right? So to give you an example from trading services, if a bank was trying to move from country A to country B, prior to the AfCFTA protocol on trading services being implemented, it may have had to have a very large capital base, have this and have that. It might have had restrictions on the number of people it could bring from outside of the country. Under the AfCFTA protocol on trading services, a lot of that is then relaxed. It wouldn't face the same sort of steep barriers, right? And so the issue is, how can we then, because all of this has been going on with the telcos, with the banks, with the creatives, with everybody, how can we then better ensure that Africans can trade on their continent in an easier and more practical way? And I think that is a question the AfCFTA tries to help us answer. So I'll stop and hand back to the moderator.
Appreciate that response, Dr. Ife. We will definitely touch more on those regional economic committees, just to see how we can further expand and share insights around just the regional specific trade activities. But yeah, just to move on to the next speaker, Mr. Michael Sudarkasa. Let's hear from you. Why is the AfCFTA especially important right now? Let's just hear how you build from the other speakers, and then we'll go next, lastly, to Dr. Rutendo Hwindingwi.
Excellent. Well, I'm going to first greet the organizers. I've noted that my camera seems to be freezing a bit. But if you can hear me, then I will continue. I'm actually joining everyone from the great state of Kentucky in the US, so a few hours behind you, but glad that the technology is holding up. I think I will pick up to some degree from Ife's point about the things that the AfCFTA catalyzes. I might say that I'm dialing in from the 6th region, if you will, because the AU includes areas where the diasporans are as a 6th region. our focus, and I think I do want to say this from the vantage point of Africa Business Group, is accelerating and including and expanding the role of the domestic private sector in particular, but the private sector in helping achieve Africa's development agenda. It's been mentioned by other colleagues on the panel how the AfCFTA is an initiative of the African Union and building on the regional economic communities, building on the efforts to create integration on the continent. However, what I've noted has been missing, and we're working to drive, and this is why I'm saying it's a catalytic initiative, is increased engagement by companies on the continent to look at their neighbors. We talked about cross-border trade, but when you talk about, and again, Idriss talked about this, someone trading from Algeria to South Africa, or from Nairobi to Dakar. That hasn't happened historically as much as it could, but the specter of what could happen in a 3 trillion GDP economy, which is all of Africa, 6 trillion if you talk about power purchasing parity, captures the mind of the private sector. But trade still requires old-fashioned blocking and tackling. It's a contact sport. So a lot of the discussion to date has been by the public sector. What we're trying to see catalyzed are businesses getting on a plane in Dakar, flying to Johannesburg, flying to Nairobi, flying to Cairo to meet a business person that they want to trade with, to put in the same energy that they may put into trying to do business in the European Union or the United States or in China into trying to do business on the continent. What AfTA does in terms of the African Continental Free Trade Area does in terms of visually giving you information that, hey, the countries are trying to address both tariff and non-tariff barriers, it's a stimulus. So I think that's one key thing. It's also a catalyst for investment, and a catalyst for investment from diasporans who often, just by virtue of making a currency, whether it's a euro or a dollar, that translates well when talking about converting that into a local currency, to say, hey, I should think about investing at home beyond, for example, just remittances. You also have parallel the work that's being done by the African Export-Import Bank in formally engaging African-led countries in the Caribbean. And so now you have, again, public sector initiatives, but you have a huge opportunity both for investment for countries that are yet still to be, this is one that is yet to be a formal partner of the AfCFTA and the under the African Export-Import Bank, which is Trinidad and Tobago, but it's the leading supplier. And in this instance, it's oil and gas products, but also purchasing automobile products from the Caribbean. So we're talking about a global African market through, the promulgation of the policies for the African Continental Free Trade Area. It's also an initiative that is accelerating and deepening focus on infrastructure investment. We've had the Program for Infrastructure Development in Africa for over 20 years, and there has been progress. But now when everyone looks and says, but you can't make things without electricity, 600 million people on the continent do not have access to electricity. We have to do something to create that opportunity. So you have the African Development Bank and you have the World Bank coming together to among other institutions, focus on infrastructure development. You also have, and we talked about the informal sector, but there's a protocol for small and medium-sized enterprises, women, and youth. And as one would know, we have a huge youth dividend upon us. We need to create jobs, but we need to create business and markets for young people who have businesses, for women who have businesses. And that's also incorporated in the African Continental Free Trade Area discussion. So you have inclusion, which is quite critical. We talk about building on the term critical minerals as we push forward with artificial intelligence and initiatives in AI. And you start thinking about how do we build intra-African value chains to add value to these minerals that historically we've just traded off the continent. So the battery project on the border of DRC and Zambia. But then we should be thinking about, okay, where are we going to sell those batteries? Can that also be on the continent? Initiatives, infrastructure initiatives like the Libido Corridor. Again, they have an extractive off the continent potentially role in counterbalancing product flow to China. This will bring product flow to the US. But even now, there are stakeholders looking at what are some of the initiatives that can be developed for other sectors like agriculture that would flow and follow the same rail line. So it's a catalytic initiative. And I think that, at different times you'll have people want to critique and say, well, I'm not seeing the numbers rise fast enough, etc. Sessions like this are important, but then there's still what I call the kind of fundamental blocking and tackling of how trade happens. Delegations have to go from one country to another country in a particular sector, meet with the different ministries in that country. You can do a lot with AI and the internet, but on the continent in particular, in large part because half of the continent doesn't have access to these digital tools because they don't have electricity, you have to make traditional relationships happen. And I think it has focused the mind a bit more. Those African multinationals, we all know about Dangote as one of them, but Strive Masiyiwa are also helping showcase what can be done when you think continentally. And in the years to come, and this is like short term in the next 5 years, and even if you look at how fast the aviation industry on the continent came back after COVID, it's also in part because you do have more African business people wanting to travel and learn more about other regions of the continent. We desperately need greater connectivity to North Africa. You typically, it's most efficient to go to France and come back down, or for the countries in the north, because in addition to Arabic, French is a key language. But those conversations are being had and within the context of regional integration, but also within the context of the AfCFTA, they're accelerating. So I will stop there, and apologies for the glitch in my camera. I'll try and fix that.
That is not a problem at all. Thank you so much, Michael. I think then for our last panelists, just to give us a sense of why the AfCFTA is especially important right now, Dr. Hwindingwi.
Hi, Judith, can you hear me? Can you see me?
Can hear you, and I can see you. 100%.
Excellent. You guys must smile, man. I know you're the unbreakables, but it doesn't mean you can break a smile. But a good evening to you all, and thank you to my colleagues who've talked before. And I think in terms of content, great content, I think the way Michael sort of has ended has brought everything, talking from Dr. Ife and Dr. Zodwa. I think from my part, why is the AfCFTA absolutely crucial at this point in time? And I think for me, there's a biblical verse that says there's a time and a season for everything. And I think prior, I've drank too much coffee, pre-Trump 2.0, I think the AfCFTA had higher energy in the government space than in the private sector space. And we can argue that on a different day. I think there was a lot happening, but I think a lot of the energy was coming out in the public space. But now with Trump coming in and obviously the world becoming very unilateral in terms of thinking from a trade perspective. In other words, guys saying, look, let's put trade policies that benefit us as opposed to multilateral, which is a discussion for another point, another day. And then the second thing with the protectionist mindset in terms of when you have the two top economies, whether it's China or America, and bear in mind, America is 30% of global GDP. Suddenly there was a realization saying, okay, the big boys are no longer just thinking of us as first. They're thinking of themselves as first. Where as Africa do we stand and what we have to do? And for me, AfCFTA represents a simple thing. It represents an increase in wealth for the continent. That whole story of 189 billion, 17% going to 18%, etc. It's all talking about creating wealth and increasing wealth of the continent, which is absolutely critical. But we're 3% of global GDP. So in other words, which is actually 3% of global wealth. So in other words, we're so small that it is ineffective for us to think individually from a continental perspective. We actually have to speak integrated. And that's why the AfCFTA is important. The free movement of goods and people is not just talking about trade. So if we buy stuff from China and then trade amongst ourselves, we're losing the plot with the Intercontinental Free Trade Agreement. But when we bring things off from the ground, whether it's agricultural products, whether it's minerals, and then we process them, therefore create another layer of jobs and industrialization. That's why you can't talk about intercontinental trade without industrialization. So you're adding value. And then when you start moving this across to another country that is making it more easier to import your stuff within the African space, it's not only value creation, but you're creating productivity, which relates to industrialization. So to really sum it up, AfCFTA in this time and age, what it represents, because when you have 54 countries, remember where politically there are 55, but let's not get into that argument because African Union realizes one thing and somebody else realizes another thing. When you have 54 countries on the African continent, heads of states, leadership, sign a document and say, guys, we're going to do this, there are very few times in history, in African history, that has happened. You can look at probably OAU, that was probably the most significant, but the last time you had 54 countries in Africa unite and say, guys, let's do this. From what it represents in this day and age, what's happening globally, from a unity, from a focused industrialization and wealth creation point, I am highly excited and very relevant in terms of what's happening. So when I look at the representation of UN, AUDA, the private sector, you've got multilateral organizations in this session today. In summary, guys, I think for me, and I'll end with this, AfCFTA is absolutely critical now. Why? Because it creates a tool or a vehicle for wealth creation on the continent that is absolutely needed in this point in time when global powers are really confused in terms of how to lead and how not to lead, hence the need for AfCFTA. So I'll end with that because I'm also honest in terms of where we are. But that's my long and short. And back to you, Judith.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hwindingwi. I think that was amazing just to set the tone in terms of summarizing what everybody else had to share from an expert panel point of view. The chats are on fire. I don't know if any of our panelists have seen and checked. So just want to give the team an idea that we will address the questions at the end from a Q&A point of view. So we will dive straight into the conversation with the panelists. But before I actually do that, as the Unbreakables, the team responsible for setting the session up, we have created an innovative chatbot. It's called Ask AfCFTA. That we'd like just everybody in the session to try and take advantage of. There's a lot of information. When you go onto the internet, there's information everywhere about the AfCFTA. But from our research, we realized that awareness is one of the critical elements that is missing in terms of building that gap from between the public and understanding what it is that the AfCFTA holds to do and what the intentions are, and as expertly given and shared in this platform by the team. the bot seeks to do that and create that knowledge, that knowledge hub around what the AfCFTA is. So I have asked one of my colleagues to drop that bot in the chat. Play around with it as the experts are talking through the questions, and then we'll just close off with the bot as well. Again, this is an AI-informed bot. Remember, with AI, we need to feed it as much information for it to actually get into a space of, that knowledge experience. Now, moving straight into the questions, under the theme of just what the barriers to the AfCFTA implementation are, right? I will give this question to Dr. Ify Ogo. You mentioned earlier just around how the regional economic committees set a path for the AfTA, right? So I just want to understand, how can these RECs be better integrated in the AfCFTA structures just to prevent trade rows from spiraling and weakening continental unity? Because these are some of the non-trade barriers that we be talking about.
Right. So sorry, there's a little noise around me. I think there's a convoy in the phone.
Not a problem, can't hear it.
Yeah, first is to say there will always be trade rows. As long as you have people transacting, there will be rows. The question is how you manage those rows and how countries choose and how the people choose to deal with the challenges in their transactions or in their relationships. In terms of how the RECs can be better integrated, I think the AfCFTA is one of those answers. If you look through the agreement itself, I think it's Article 19, that says that the RECs are the building blocks of the AfCFTA. And they have to be, because in some ways, actually in many ways, there is deeper integration in some RECs than you find in the AfCFTA. Over time, the continent should get there. So you'll see there's progressive elimination of tariffs. So you'll see that, okay, for say band A of trading goods, which should be 90% of tariff lines over 5 to 10 years, depending on the category of country, tariffs will go down to 0. Right? So then everybody will be at the same point. But as of today, we're not at that point. It will take time to get to that point. Also, you find, especially for trading goods, you find that some RECs are already having what they call common external tariffs. So they already apply one rate or one tariff book externally. You find that, for example, with SACO. You find that with ECOWAS. You say that with EAC. So the RECs are important because they've already reached a certain deeper level of integration that they need to further coordinate in the AfCFTA until the continent gets to that single point. Now, institutionally, within the AfCFTA structure, there is a coordination mechanism for the RECs and the AfCFTA Secretariat, wherein, policy-wise, institution-wise, they can engage, they can agree, and they can sort out any issues that may arise. So that does exist in the context of the AfCFTA.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Ify. I think let me give the next question to Dr. Hwindingwi. I know that you have a hard stop at 7:10. Just looking at the barriers to the implementation of the AfTA as well. As a strategist, how can African businesses just proactively deal with trade uncertainty when even AfTA member states are putting up barriers against each other? There's just that conflict. How can we deal with this from a business point of view?
Judith, you really gave me a hospital pass, eh? And fortunately, you're on virtual. I would have complained officially. Look, I think what businesses, what I share in the discussion that I'm involved in terms of AfCFTA, in the old days, I'll liken it to this, when IT was I remember in my early days of studying MBA or studying school, IT was a tool. It wasn't going to change your business. It wasn't going to make your business more competitive. It didn't mean it took away strategy or all the other departments. It was a tool. Why am I highlighting that to be short and specific? The AfCFTA is an instrument. It's a tool. It's an environment and a platform that has been put together through the leadership of governments in conjunction with the private and public sector. So for the private sector, for businesses to benefit out of this, they have to understand it. And they must understand in terms of the structure and the elements of it, because it creates a platform for them to be equipped and to be competitive, as well as to be productive and industrialized. So why is this crucial? And especially when you're looking at small, medium startups, the big corporates, yes, they'll benefit as well. But it creates an environment, or it creates an instrument that allows organizations to be able to leverage off each other from a continental perspective, from a country-to-country perspective. Yes, there'll be arguments, there'll be riffraffs, but at the end of the day, when you put policies in place, when you make tariffs and quotas competitive so that you promote industrialization on the continent, it's your responsibility as a business to understand what it means. So if I produce cotton, I need to understand which are the markets that are in demand for cotton in the African space, and what are the most effective and efficient routes to get that to market. And people like Afreximbank and AFDB and the African Union through the AUDA have created a lot of context, they've created a lot of policies in tools to actually help business people in order to achieve this. So I think also what I want to highlight is it does not mean that the business person or the entrepreneur must be lazy, because people are now thinking, wow, the AfCFTA is there, I can just relax and things will just happen like a jolly petrol. Well, in actual fact, there's a lot of investment that has gone, but it's still your responsibility to actually understand what are the advantages that are there. And it's only by doing this, when we realize it's an instrument that creates an environment that makes us more industrialized, more competitive, and positions us to be globally competitive as a continent, do we actually reap the rewards. So it actually highlights you need to do your homework, as opposed to sit on your what's the right word, blessed assurance, as they would say in safe realms. So that's how I'll place it. I'm just keeping my responses short, because I know that there are a number of other subject matter experts on the call who can actually give insights, but it's an instrument, a powerful instrument that creates an environment that can take this continent to the next level.
Very happy with that. Thank you so much, Doctor. I think let's move straight to the next question. I will give it to Amine, Idriss, Adoum. This question it's in relation to our research. Our research findings unearthed opportunities in Africa, right? And these mentioned real barriers slowing the AfCFTA implementation, such as infrastructure bottlenecks. You've all mentioned that, fragmented regulation, and just political inertia. Just given the heightened urgency driven by the global trade landscape at the moment, what are the most critical practical steps that need to be taken now to overcome these barriers and just unlock the full potential of the AfCFTA? I know some of them have already been touched on, and just in the interest of time, if we can just get a quick summary of what those steps can be and what they look like.
So maybe let me understand better the question. You are asking what are the steps that need to be taken to overcome non-tariff barrier?
100%.
Okay, I think it's going to be very difficult to be very short, but let me try, because this is probably the most difficult part of the AfCFTA. And I want to take an example, because it's better when you take an example for people to understand. So assume that you have a company that produce good in Ghana, and let me take the example of Ghana, and want to export it to Cameroon. The first challenge that this company will face today is really about the tariff itself, because for instance, while AfCFTA aims to eliminate about 90% of tariff on goods, this process itself is gradual, and it will go into full effect by 2033, I think, and it will even start really only in 2026. So full liberalization is expected in about 10 years, let's put it like that. So that means that as of today, if from Ghana to Cameroon, you still have to face tariff. But then come the question of the non-tariff barriers. Non-tariff barriers, there are many, and they are quite restrictive. So exporters who face non-tariff barriers like import on bans, quota, restrictive licensing requirements, all of those actually are there. And this actually can significantly increase the cost, but also the complexity of the trade itself. So, and that actually may offset the benefits of the tariff reduction. Even if you have tariff reduction, you still have to face actually those non-tariff barriers. But then come as well the question of the rule of origin. And this is the ROO is probably one of the most complex. Take the example again of Ghana. So you manufacture a good, you want to export in Cameroon, but then while there is this protocol on rule of origin, take the case of the packaging material. In Africa, we import most of the packaging. Most of the packaging are imported. So packaging is often imported, and under the AfCFTA rule, simple packaging operations, for instance, I would say, such as placing product into containers, are considered as insufficient. They are very insufficient to confer origin. So therefore, even with the rules of origin, if the packaging materials are imported from outside the AfCFTA, then the packaging process is deemed minimal, and the final product actually may not qualify for preferential treatment. And this issue of the packaging is usually overlooked. People don't think about it, but this is actually critical. Of course, you have as well the issue of the limited institutional capacity. I think Dr. Ife spoke about it, lack of awareness, and this is actually, I think Dr. Michael spoke about that, especially from the private sector. But then you have as well the question of the logistics and the transport. In terms of, I should have included that in the non-tariff barrier. Between the port of Douala, I don't know if you know Cameroon, port of Douala and N'Djamena. N'Djamena is the capital of Chad. There is about 1,800 kilometers of road. So half of it is rail and half of it is actually a paved road. There is about 100 barriers, security barriers, health barriers, forestry control barriers, whatever kind, every kind of barrier there for 1,800 kilometers. So and for every barrier, you have to face control, you have to pay, you have to do this, you have to do that. Now, how to overcome this? There are recommendations, of course, from the AfCFTA. I think the role of the REX is important, but it's not enough. It requires really proper institutional capacity building within our countries. And, the World Bank and the IMF keep to say, they tell us that our civil service is quite overloaded. It's not true, by the way. Most of the African countries, we have very weak, very poor, and very understaffed public service. Again, let me go back to Cameroon. If you take Cameroon, there is about 4 civil servants for 1,000 people. 4 civil servants for 1,000 people in Cameroon. Compared to the US, where you have about 80 people for 80 civil servants in general for 1,000 people. So I have made a small calculation to demonstrate that a civil servant in Cameroon does the work of 11 American civil servants, one single civil servant. So our civil service is quite understaffed. We really lack capacity. So if we want to fully implement the AfCFTA, we definitely need actually to push and to increase the capacity of our public service. South Africa and Egypt are probably among the best staffed public service in Africa. South Africa is around 50 for 1,000 people, and Egypt is around 45, 48 for 1,000 people. Other than that, everyone is below 15, with few countries like Mali is 2 for 1,000 population. So this is actually critical. We tend to forget all those elements. So I just wanted to share with you those very practical challenges that we are facing. Let me conclude by 2 things, actually, because I think I hear, was it Dr. Michael? No, Dr. Rutendo, who was speaking about the electricity. Yes, there is a Mission 300 from the World Bank and the African Development Bank. But before the Mission 300, we started at AUDA-NEPAD to come with what we call the Continental Power System Master Plan, which is the Africa Master Plan actually for electrification. We want by 2040 to achieve not universal access, but at least 80% of our population to have access to electricity. But that means that we need to multiply by 5 our power generation capacity. Today in Africa, we produce around 230, 270 gigawatt of power. This is the installed capacity that we have today. But you need to take it to 1,200 by 2040. No, so multiply it almost by 5. That means that it requires investment. The investment required is around $1.4 trillion, definitely. And we need to go in a very systematic manner. That's the reason why we have established what we call the regional power pool. So as of today, you have in each region the power pool. And to make sure that we can attract investment, we really need to create the market. So SADC, for instance, which have the South African power pool, is the most advanced today. They started trading. Then we have as well the UNDP in East Africa. They will be about to trade as well. And then we need to connect the regional power pool among each other. So regions that have capacity, that can attract investment, actually would attract investment, they can produce and they can start actually trading with other regions. And that's one of the way that we found to help us really to overcome this challenge of access to electricity. And in parallel to that, we still need to continue to invest into what we call the small grid, so the mini grid. And this is actually what the World Bank and the African Development Bank are doing with the Mission 300, giving access to 300 million people, giving electricity to 300 million people by 2030. But this is not the solution that will fix our problem. What will fix our problem are the Continental Power System Master Plan and the Africa Single Electricity Market, which are basically, they have become now the national policy in all our countries, including South Africa, by the way, because South Africa is one of the biggest supporters of the CMP and the AfCFTA. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that insight, Amine. I think that was very valuable to understand what those two policies aim to do, obviously underscoring the importance of the AfCFTA. Again, in the interest of time, because we really want to give the platform to the chat and have the panelists answer a lot of the questions that our attendees are asking, I will just go to Michael Sudarkasa, just looking at just the urgency of the AfCFTA as well. Sources suggest that the African Growth and Opportunity Act, also known as AGOA, is now seen as good as dead, right? And this is all due to the new tariffs. How does the decline of preferential access to markets like the US underscore the importance of building a strong, unified continental market through the AfCFTA?
Well, I think that the verdict may be out, but the fact that there's this current 10% kind of almost across the board, except for a handful of countries where it's even higher, does put paid to the African Growth and Opportunity Act, which allowed for duty-free entry of products from Africa for close to 30 years now. But the fact of the matter is there were actually a handful of countries that really took advantage of AGOA in the first place. But the rapidity with which that door seemed to be closed was shocking. And I think that's what, I mean, there were countries like South Africa, Lesotho, Kenya, that made products that really did benefit, and it is going to hurt in the short term. And I think because it will hurt in the short term, there's this scramble, for lack of a better term, to look at where else can we trade. And so again, $3 trillion, $6 trillion purchasing power parity market of a unified Africa has to be in the conversation because of the proximity of the countries on the continent to one another. But do know that you have traditional trade partners, or I'll say more increasingly traditional trade partners like China, that are saying, hey, we will, particularly to South Africa, we will look to absorb some of your agricultural produce and some of your value-added produce. So what is happening broadly is a reordering of global trade patterns and who's considered a trade ally. On the continent, there's a need for us to embrace initiatives like the Intra-Africa Trade Fair, which this year in September will be held in Algeria. This will be the fourth rendition of it. It's held every other year, and it offers an opportunity to have a continental trading platform But typically, the participants have been from the region that it's been held in. So it's been held twice in Egypt, once in South Africa. Now it's going to be held in Algeria. But we really need to promote that to our private sector. There's also an African Caribbean Trade and Investment Forum, which will be held in July. We need to promote that. I think, to be fair as well, the issue of mobility has been raised because of this need to focus on how do we do business on the continent? Well, if I can't get a visa to go to the country next door very easily, that's a problem. So countries like Rwanda, even Kenya has relaxed its policies. They become the standard bearer and the benchmark. So again, definitely we are looking at a period where, when the U.S. says we're going to have America first policies, then other countries, and it's not just the continent, but then people say, well, what does an Africa first policy look like? Well, it should incorporate the African Continental Free Trade Area because our African Union has put this on the table. How do we unpack it? I think it was mentioned that really understanding this, breaking I'll call it the jargon. Even people that trade don't always think about rules of origin. What they think about is there's a market and there's an opportunity. And so my competitor went and traded in this country and did well. Let me go and do well. So parallel to, again, the conversations that are happening at the governmental levels, we have to have more conversations happening between business people. And again, a tariff is not an ultimate barrier to doing trade or business. What it does is makes your product a bit more expensive. Typically that gets passed on to the consumer. So it makes you less competitive, but it doesn't mean you can't trade. And so even with for example, the raised tariffs for AGOA, BMW and Ford will still be trying to trade products because they have a market in North America for those products. They'll be lobbying Congress people and trying to get that reduced, like Apple did with China. This is a digression, to say, hey, look, this trade thing you're doing is going to kill us. You got to backtrack. So I believe there'll actually be more of the backtracking. But in any event, the fact that it all happened shook the trading system that we knew, has a lot more people thinking about intra-Africa trade, and that's a positive because it's accelerating. If we had just kept going the way we would, I don't think in 2025 there'd be as much focus on AfCFTA as there is. So somehow a favor has been done for the continent.
100% agreed. This is the time for us to take advantage of the policy. It is the time for us to spread our voices wide, just to get that awareness out there and get the ball rolling. So I'll move to our last panelist, Zodwa. I'll give you this question just around digital trade. How can digital trade platforms accelerate participation just of smaller countries and SMEs as well in the aftermarkets? We are living in a digital era right now. Yes, digital activity uptake may be lower in certain countries in Africa, but overall, that is essentially where the world is headed. So what do you think about that? About these platforms taking advantage?
Well, I think the one innovation that came with the African Continental Free Trade Area is the Digital Trade Protocol, which basically recognizes the uptake of e-commerce on the continent. With young people comfortable with technology, I think it has a huge potential. Basically to increase intra-Africa trade. But again, for it to work, we do need to invest in ICT. I mean, in the ICT infrastructure. If you look at the whole infrastructure, I think you need energy, obviously, because to power your gadgets, there's need for energy. So that whole issue around infrastructure is very critical for the continent to benefit from digital trade. Again, we are seeing a proliferation of these platforms, which is a good thing. But again, we also need to address the issue of currencies, which is what PAPS, the Pan-African Payment Settlement System, is trying to address. So I would say it requires a lot of coordination and also a comprehensive strategy for it to work. Issues on ICT infrastructure, the payment platform, access to technology, and a whole lot of things, but also the issue of harmonization of policies. A lot of countries are having issues with the regulation of digital trade, which I think the African Continental Free Trade Area is coming up to address. Definitely a good innovation for small and medium enterprises, but it also hinges on access to technology. Thanks.
Thank you for that, Zodwa. I think then this has been quite an insightful session. I think it is very clear that there are quite some barriers that we still need to overcome, just as a continent. And these, of course, fall within the trade and non-trade barriers. A lot of challenges, but we all know that within the challenges, there's always opportunities. Just like Michael Sudarkasa just said, the opportunity is there for us to implement the AfCFTA and see how it works best in our favor, just to grow the African continent, especially in light of these external global tensions at the moment. So, good people, I really appreciate the contribution from the panel. I think right now it is time to open the floor to our guests, our attendees, from a Q&A point of view, right? From the chat. So we will, as the Unbreakables, just open up the floor just to read up some of those questions and then address them to the panelists. I can start. I saw a very interesting question coming in from Zukile Dambuza, and I think I want to give this to Michael. You did mention around, just visa and regulations and mobility issues in Africa. So Zukile is asking, what policy reforms are needed to ease visa requirements and facilitate the free movement of traders, professionals, and business travelers within Africa?
Well, definitely mobility is a key one. So if everyone took and I'm just most familiar with the Rwanda policy, which says if you have an African passport, you in essence get a visa stamp on arrival. That would, I won't say revolutionize, but would be huge for the continent. Where you have, and I'll give you an example of this, even changes, for example, in South Africa's visa policy with Ghana, where Ghana was given the same policy leeway that you have for coming from the US or Europe, where you get 90 days, basically no questions asked, you show up with your passport. The tourism from Ghana to South Africa went up something like 150% in a year. When you come to a country as a business person, even you're on holiday, you start looking around, if the airport process is efficient and welcoming, you're like, hey, I could come back here. I could, come here and do business. And then if you see things that are in your country that aren't there, you start thinking about, well, if I had a business reason to come, I could come more often. And so then you start asking questions that are different than if you go somewhere where it's hostile. So the mobility issue is a critical one. I don't think, and again, unfortunately, in some of our biggest markets, Nigeria, Egypt, South Africa, Algeria. It's not so easy for Africans to travel to those countries. So that would be a huge step forward if that could happen. I also feel like we have to provide a bit more information about the sectoral trade platforms that exist on the continent. So many people are aware of the mining indaba. I'm just using that one. Or in South Africa, the tourism indaba. South Africa has a very developed MICE industry, meetings, incentives, conferences, exhibitions. Rwanda, in a very short period of time, has put itself on the map in that category. But organizing the process of getting information about sectors, disseminating information about sectors, who buys, who sells, is another critical aspect. So the intra-African trade fair does this on a continental basis, but we do still trade and do business regionally. So at least being able to say the top 20 business events in ECOWAS are X. They might deal with cocoa, they might deal with cashew, they might deal with oil and gas, but then everybody is aware of them. Similarly in East Africa, Central Africa, Southern Africa. So there's a huge, we developed our Africa Business Handbook and made it online because there's this information dearth. So we need to do a lot more of these, the webinars, but then the bot is a fantastic addition to what we need. But in general, if you're an African business person and you want to do business in Asia, in North America, and in Europe, you have 50, 60, 100 different resources that helps you get to minutia about that process. When we talk about Africa, unfortunately, there's a dearth. So I'll stop there. And this is really for the people in academia. There's a need for more of that. The people in the advisory services, I mean, one of the things that the AfCFTA does do is allow you to trade in services across lines. So we actually need to amalgamate some of our consultancies so that we can actually cover the continent and provide insight for our business colleagues cost effectively and seamlessly. So, I mean, these are things you do find in other large markets where a given enterprise has branches all over. So anyway, these are some of the areas that we see that we think are needed. And again, AfCFTA this year, with the geopolitical developments that we've had, is pushing those, which is a positive thing.
Thank you for that, Michael. And thank you to the participants that asked that question. I think the theme around that question just it looked at how can Africa overcome infrastructure and logistics to enable the success of AfCFTA. So thank you to Akona, Pumla, and Zukile for asking that question. So I will pass the mic on to Dr. Ifi Ogo. Just looking at governance and implementation support, some of the questions that came in the chat around governance and institutional mechanisms needed. Just what role do governance structures, leadership, and institutional support play in turning the AfCFTA into a functional tool for integration? And these questions, were just summarized from Sia, Nico, Akona, and Phyllis.
Right. Okay. So I think let's attempt to answer this by looking at the AfCFTA agreement itself. The AfCFTA agreement itself is signed by the public sector. Typically, there's a negotiator from the Ministry of Trade who signs, who will go through all of the issues, and then it goes to the assembly, and then it's the it's a government instrument in terms of who holds it and who the custodian is. Also on implementation, a lot of the obligations, and I was actually just going through the agreement itself this afternoon, and I was going through the protocol on trade and services. A lot of I think it's only the protocol on investment where you begin to see obligations for businesses and communities. the specific commitments that are undertaken by the public sector, by the state, some institution, some agency will be responsible for implementing it, right? So this is essentially a state-driven activity, if you will, right? Now, how does it work? So one of the things that state parties agreed to is that every state party would have what they call a national implementation committee. And this is to reflect the breadth of work that needs to happen and the ways in which trade is conducted. So for example, the Ministry of Trade might have driven the agreement, but then when your goods get to the ports, you deal with all kinds of agencies, right? You deal with standards, you deal with customs, you deal with whoever else at the port who has to clear your goods. It might even be the tax agency. If you're in trade and services, you might need a license from an institution. It might even be a private sector one. It might not even be a state-backed one, right? So the idea is that these, if you want to call them trade facilitation institutions or regulators, need to understand the AfCFTA, need to understand their role in the AfCFTA and understand what their function is. Some countries have done quite well in creating a whole of government approach to the AfCFTA beyond just the committees. Some have created even AfCFTA desks within certain institutions to be able to deal with these issues efficiently. Another thing you'll see across the board is that many countries have what they call AfCFTA implementation strategies. Sometimes they're public, sometimes they're not. But the idea is that many, and I think by my count, over 30 now, have some sort of thinking and documentation as to what it is they're trying to achieve through the AfCFTA, how the AfCFTA sits within the broader macroeconomic, political, institutional landscape, and how their ambitions, what they're trying to achieve through the AfCFTA, how they're going to coordinate institutions, right? So I would say that in the majority of countries, there's been some sort of thinking, and for quite a few, there's been some sort of documenting as to how they want to approach. What could be done better? We could think through as a continent more reporting ways. We could think about disaggregating AfCFTA trade flows, because there is trade under the AfCFTA. There have been imports and exports of goods. And it would be interesting to begin to think through the kinds of mechanisms that not only about trade flows, but about the trading experience, about the efficiency of institutions, right? About the frictions and how they're reported. For example, continentally, we have the non-tariff barriers reporting mechanism. That's one way to track trade. It's not necessarily from the most positive light, but it's an important way to track and see, who is reporting whom and for what, right? So yes, there are the institutions that exist. The state is, in terms of implementation of the agreement itself, the state is, the driver of that. There is a need to coordinate across border countries with all of the agencies and institutions, and with the private sectors that might be the custodian of several parts of the agreement. And there's a need, I would argue, to now think through the kinds of reporting mechanisms that allow us to see how the AfCFTA actually works for people.
Appreciate that. Thank you, Dr. Ife. I'll pass the next question to Zodwa. This is just looking at the informal sector and youth participation, and how we ensure inclusion in the informal sector and youth. I mean, earlier, Michael mentioned that the youth market is large, and we need to create inclusive opportunities for these markets. So the question came in from Lusanda and Jenjasami, and it just looks at what strategies do we need to include informal traders and youth in AfCFTA's trade ecosystem? Zodwa, if you can take that question, please.
Okay, thank you, Judith. I think the question we should be asking ourselves is, why is there informality? Why do people choose to trade informally? And I'll go back to what Dr. Ife said initially, that Africa has been trading for the longest time. And unfortunately, when you set up these trading blocks, I don't think they took into account the border community. the border communities. I'll make an example. I come from Eswatini. We have a border with Mozambique. We call it Lomahasha, and on the Mozambican side, it's called Namach. That border was a hive of activity before. I would say we were strict on these issues of rules of origin and who, because these, I mean, you find one family on this part of the border and the other one on the next. The language is the same, and basically because Mozambique had a war situation, so they were buying a lot of their supplies from the Swatini side. And actually, that town was a hive of activity. We had huge companies there providing a lot of supplies to the Mozambican community. But immediately we set up the SADC free trade area, where now we're very strict on the rules of origin. Where do these goods come from? A lot of that trade just couldn't take place. And I'm sure it does happen, but it happens informally, because people always have a way of moving goods across. And actually, when you look at studies, it says about 40% of Africa's trade is informal, and it's not captured. And a lot of young people are engaged in it. In fact, I think there was a study sponsored by a Canadian institution that discovered that in East Africa, the main actors in informal trade are women and the youth and young people. So for me, I feel we should promote what we call the simplified trade regime, which was first introduced by COMESA, where you basically simplify the trade, the like rules of origin and the requirements, and agree that the countries agree on a threshold. That way, you allow people to trade formally, and you can capture that trade. It also reduces the security issues that women face, because if they conduct informal trade, they fall victim to victimization and some sort of harassment. So I would say a simplified trade to basically reduce informality, make it easier for people to trade across borders. But also it requires a lot of information, send out information there about what are the requirements of trading under any trading arrangement that is there. Could it be SADC, or the COMESA, or EAS, or ECOWAS? Make that information available. And sometimes you may want to move beyond the English language or French to include the local languages. Just simplify the trade rules to limit informality.
Great. Thank you for that input, Zodwa. I am getting from our colleagues that we have been allocated an extra 10 minutes for the session. I mean, it is a very hot one. I just want to get in the last question from the attendees. And I'll direct this question to Amine. Just looking at manufacturing. Oh, apologies. I'm hearing that Mr. Amine is out. Okay, cool. So I think do we have enough time for one more question from the chat? Okay, cool. Zodwa? Yeah, Zodwa, I'll give you this same question. Apologies for that. Production is running crazy behind the scenes here. Zodwa, I will give you the question just around manufacturing and value-added exports. This question came in from Pumla and Zukile, and it just looks at what are the core challenges and incentives needed to grow Africa's manufacturing sector and reduce reliance on raw commodity exports?
There are a lot. Investments in energy, infrastructure, investment in transport logistics, but also you need to develop regional value chains across countries. It's I think we, under the African Continental Free Trade Area, there's that realization that you can't actually boost intra-African trade without industrialization. But there are issues around that. I've mentioned that my agency, we do help our member states with industrialization policies. But the question then comes with the actual implementation, the financing. Financing also becomes an issue. Africa would require a lot of investments to engage. I mean, to grow its industrial base, and it requires then issues around harmonizing investment policies, making the continent conducive to external investment, but also domestic investment. So what we are focusing on is resource mobilization, domestic one, because also when you think about the pensions in Africa, where are they invested? Mainly they are invested out of the continent where they yield higher returns. But that basically means you are giving capital to other countries who probably don't need it. Again, when you look at the cost of borrowing in Africa, it's very high, which makes it very difficult to access finance. I would say intensify resource mobilization for investment, but also make the investment environment conducive and attractive to both domestic and foreign direct investment. The last thing that I would like to emphasize is the importance of small and medium enterprises. It's not feasible, or it's not how can I put it? It doesn't make sense for us to expect a small an SME to export to meet all the requirements. But if an SME is capacitated in such a way that it can provide the non-core services to multinational companies, to the big companies that actually export, they indirectly benefit. And that's the model that Singapore followed, basically to say we'll bring the multinational companies to Singapore, but we will be capacitating our small and medium enterprises to provide quality services like packaging, like, if like, for instance, a company like IBM comes, their focus is manufacturing of computers. But if there are other services that they require, they have to find them within the country, which is where then the government has to play a major role, the business development agencies, to make sure that SMEs are capacitated to provide quality services to multinational companies. That way, everybody benefits. It's not just the bigger companies that have the capacity to export. So sort of like inclusive, including everyone in this whole regional integration. I would say that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Zodwa Mabuza, all the way from the United Nations Economic Commission from Africa, that is also known as the UNECA. I think the last question I'll give to Michael, seeing that Michael is still in the house. I want to milk all that information out of his head. I think I will address a question that one of our attendees asked in the chat. I think he asked, his name is Lukula Mollo. He just asked, how does one get involved in this trade mission in order to promote their own products? I think ultimately that's what a lot of youths, a lot of entrepreneurs, SMEs, business owners are trying to figure out, like, what does this mean for me?
Sure, no, and I think that is the question, at least from our vantage point, that we want many more businesses to ask, because to me, that's where the rubber hits the road. The Department of Trade and Industry, I'm assuming that he's speaking from South African context, but you have different institutions like a DTI in other countries, actually have been quite involved in organizing missions, for example, to participate in the intra-African trade fair. And the way that the intra-African trade fair is actually structured, it's structured around country pavilions. If you go to many other, I'll call them industry exhibitions, it's by what part of the industry you're involved in. Whereas IATF, there'd be a South Africa pavilion. So if I'm a business person that's interested in IATF, one step would be to contact DTI. The other, and again, there's the bot that's been mentioned, there's the African Business Handbook that's been mentioned, is to do research. No one has mentioned the guided trade initiative, which is kind of still on the books, I would say, but the desire from the Secretariat is to expand it. But there were 7 countries that had said, we would like to, we've met protocols for AfCFTA, and we've identified certain products. And now we're open for companies in those sectors to do business. So you could say, I want to really look at Ghana, for example, if I'm sitting in South Africa, or I really want to look at Kenya. And you can drill down to learn, do we qualify for the rules of origin? Yes, we should. And again, the process of trade, I'll say that part still hasn't changed. Who are my competitors? What is my price? What is the price in the market? If I add the tariff, what is the competitiveness of my product? What trade shows exist in the marketplace that I can go to and I can see where do we sit? All of those steps one would do as a business person in South Africa interested in a given country. You got to factor in, what does it cost for me to fly there? What does it cost for me to stay in a hotel a couple of nights? Can I set up meetings with agents, distributors, potential partners? One of the things that we haven't talked as much about, but we mentioned, and I do think it's a big part of the African Free Trade Area, is, again, value chain development. So you could say, I might be supplying a bigger company in South Africa that's already a multinational, like our shopping, ShopRite Checkers, for example. I'm a supplier to ShopRite. ShopRite has ShopRites all over the continent. They're trading. What you get out of that process is supplier development support. That is key to have our smaller businesses become more competitive. I like what was said about kind of relaxing the simplified trade regime. The challenge will be, to me, is that our companies, the smaller ones, still have to get stronger, because the continent, as we form, we haven't talked about this today, one big market becomes attractive to everybody else in other parts of the world. So Chinese companies, French companies, American companies will say, hey, I can do, if I set up in South Africa or set up in Nigeria, I can trade across this 2 billion person market in 25 years. So we have to add value. We're going to have to strengthen capacity, but building value chains is a critical aspect toward doing that. And I think, again, these sensitization platforms are going to be critical. Again, I talked a lot about it. It's something that we've been looking to focus on and we'll speak more about. But AI also now accelerates that information gathering process. So again, I'll speak about the bot, but if you don't have the bot, you can do a lot more prompting and researching much faster today than you could, let's say, a year ago, to get information about the market that you're interested in. I think that those are some of the first steps, and there's increasingly more capital available. It's still, the missing middle still struggles to find adequate capital for initiatives, but there is more. There are more, whether it's public sector capital, impact investment capital. The DFI capital is probably, the multilateral capital is there, but if you talk about capital coming from donors, that's going down. But I just tell private sector, because we're really trying now, we're trying to engage with the private sector to say, look, take a step, think globally, think continentally, but act locally, because you'll find that there's more resources in your country. The same people who've done that AfCFTA strategy for your country are looking for companies who will actually knock on the door and actually do things under that strategy.
100%.
So then they become your ally. Let me stop there, but it's excellent
100%.
conversation.
Appreciate that input. Thank you so much, Michael. Yeah, and that is us, everybody. Really appreciate the time that all our panelists had for us today. That was Michael Sudarkasa once again, Chairman for Africa Business Group. I think I will hand over just last check-in from my colleague Cam Shaw, who will close us off. Seeing that we did run over time, but I don't think that was in vain, because there's a lot of input and insight that came out of the session. Thank you.
Thank you, Judith. And good evening to you all. I'm Kamsha from the Unbreakables. And firstly, we want to say a huge thank you to everybody for staying the extra time. It really just reiterates the significance of our topic tonight. Thank you to our esteemed panelists for your robust discussion and the depth, honesty, and the hope you shared tonight. To our audience, thank you for your fantastic engagement. We really appreciate your questions and the passion you had for discussing the topic with us. Tonight has made very clear that the African Continental Free Trade Area isn't just an agreement signed in Addis Ababa or Accra. It's an opportunity for each of us to reimagine what Africa can trade, build, and become. As our speakers have said, the path forward will require more than vision. It would require hard work, bold investment, policy reform, and a collective belief. You've heard Idriss say that industrialization and digitization are the future of AfCFTA, and again, this requires everybody's initiative. Michael shared that trade is a contact sport, and we need to be able to do business seamlessly if we are to have better connectivity across the continent. So the time for hesitation has passed. The time for action is now. And in closing, I would like to quote Dr. Rutendo that there's a time and a season for everything. And I believe that there's never been a more critical time for 54 countries to unite. So to this end, we'd like to keep the conversations going. We encourage you to connect with our speakers today, follow them on social media, engage with our bot, AskAfCFTA, and stay active in shaping Africa's economic future. Let's keep building the Africa we know is possible, and we thank you all for participating with us on this vital conversation. Kujenga Africa, and have a great evening from the Unbreakables.